right, so I wanted to just go through some of the skulls a little bit more, especially going through the kind of chapters 13 and 14, looking at the Australopiths versus the genus Homo. So I want to start off here. We have Ardipithecus, or Ardi, and then next to it we have Lucy, an Australopithecine. And these can look really similar, right? They're very, very similar because they are ancestrally related. Some ways to distinguish these. Remember, you're going to want to look at things like the postorbital constriction. It's very small on both of these, but it is wider on the Australopith. Also, the teeth are much smaller on Lucy than they are compared to Ardi. Ardi has just a slightly larger canine. She's a little bit more prognathic. And if you look at the mandibles, you can see that Ardi really has that very thick ape-like simian shelf. And Lucy is starting to lose that. It's becoming a little bit more gracile. Obviously, here we have our side branch of Paranthropus. You can tell him apart because of his sagittal crest, right, for extra chewing muscle. He is exceptionally prognathic, very flared, and so he is a side branch for all of these specialized adaptations that we're not going to see in the other lines. Everything else on the table is the genus Homo, and there are some specific features that I'll go over to identify each. But I know it can be sometimes hard when we're looking at Homo habilis because he's the same general size as Lucy. But when you look at these next to each other, it should be very obvious. One looks very ape-like, the other looks much more human-like. We have a much wider postorbital constriction here. So the frontal lobe is much wider, the face is less prognathic, and overall the brain size is slightly bigger and much more rounded. So when you're looking at an Australopith versus a very early genus Homo, I want you to look for those more human-like traits, especially with how the face is shaped. Now when we come to Homo erectus, what I want you to look at, first of all, is this right here. It's a sagittal keel. It's not a crest like Paranthropus. It's not for extra chewing muscle. It's just a lump along the sagittal line because their brains were asymmetrical. If you turn the skull around, you can see that the widest part is at the bottom, giving them almost a mushroom cap shape to their skull. That's also that's unique to Homo erectus. So if you see a sagittal keel or a mushroom-shaped skull, you are dealing with Homo erectus. For Homo Heidelbergensis, we still have a little bit of a chunky, blocky face with those big brow ridges, but the brain size is larger and the widest part has moved up to the top. So that is very different from Homo erectus. I also want to show you the jaw, if we can kind of zoom in here. The teeth are really filed down, and that is evidence of making clothing. So remember, we have Homo erectus in Africa losing body hair because they're long distance runners. They migrate out into Asia. By the time we get hundreds of thousands of years later to Homo heidelbergensis in Europe, it's an ice age. So not having body hair, you're going to be cold. You're going to need to make clothing out of animal fur, and the filed down teeth really show that they were using their mouths to do this. Next, we have the Neanderthals. You can see, first of all, if you kind of zoom up on top of it, they have the largest brains. Their brains are bigger than humans, bigger than any of the other hominins. They have the largest brains at about 1,700 cubic centimeters. Ours is only about 1,400. Other than this massive brain on the back, you have the occipital bun. This area around the occipital bone that is very blocky, that's for extra muscle. That would help them in their ambush style hunting. And they have a very large nasal opening because they lived in an Arctic climate. They also have the filed down teeth because of using their teeth to help make clothing. So here we have Homo sapiens, or Cromagnon man. When you look at his face, it is very flat It's also a lot more gracile or slender, right? We don't have those huge kind of caveman brow ridges. The forehead is flat. That is one way you can identify a modern Homo sapien. Also look at the nice round globular skull. Again, we don't have the largest brains, but we do have the roundest brains. And to identify a modern human, you want to look at the mandible. We are the only ones with a chin. You can see I can grab this area, it sticks forward. This is an indicative sign of a human. Everything else either has flat to where it's not sticking forward, or it's actually going to recede backwards. Okay, so chins and flat foreheads, how you identify modern Homo sapien. And then we have our interesting side branch here, the Hobbit Homofloresiensis, our tiny 3-foot tall hominin who lived until very recently, only until about 18,000 years ago. Again, you might be a little bit confused when you're comparing this to maybe a Homo habilis. When we look at these skulls, though, look at how much narrower the Hobbit is. If I turn it to the side, a very flat face. And when we look at the frontal lobe, much wider on the Hobbit than on Homo habilis. So you want to look for those key features. Does it have more ape-like features? That's going to be more of your Australopiths. As you're starting to get a flatter face and a larger frontal lobe, you're getting into the genus Homo. And then once you get into more modern times, you're starting to see the very flat face, the very small teeth, and a very wide frontal lobe. So you can see here, even going from Homo erectus to Heidelbergensis, we're widening to Neanderthals, very wide. The widest being ours, it's basically at our eye orbits. It doesn't really pinch in much at all. So we have the most developed frontal lobe of all of these.